We're live.
Okay, Brother Ryan, would you lead us in prayer?
I will do so. All right, let's pray. God of compassion and creation and love,
lead us in prayer.
I will do so. Ooh.
Oh,
I'm not sure what. God of compassion and creation and love, looping. I will do so. That's not going to be good. I don't know why it's doing that. How do I? Okay.
I can see them now. Can anybody see me?
no.
Praying, Mom.
What?
He's saying a prayer and you need to mute, okay?
Okay, let's try this again. God of compassion and justice and love, we give thanks for gathering us together today that we might discuss and grow in our understanding of what it means to be your people. We give thanks that each of the members of this community who have come here are seeking to know more, and we ask that your Holy Spirit would move in each of us that we might speak your words and hear your will. Pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
All righty, let's start with our chapter, Self-Help in Hard Times. And let's start with the first question. Why did the Seattle strike end after only 5 days? At the beginning of your chapter. Does anybody remember anything about the strike itself? It was a very peaceful strike. Everything was taken care of. They had milk stations set up for people to have that. They had the fire department not go on strike, so there would still be fire coverage. And the city stopped functioning except for necessities. Laundries only did the laundry of the hospital. They even had war vets go and try to keep order. And I thought the amazing thing was they had the actual crime rate went down during this strike. But does anybody know why it ended after 5 days with something so peaceful and going so well? Okie dokie, I'll tell you. There was some dissent among the union leaders about the whole thing. I thought it sounded like the most organized, wonderful thing. But then the mayor, he swore in 2,400 special deputies, 1,000 sailors, and Marines were brought in. And even though everything was going well, it was too hard to deal with everything where the whole city was shut down. This time the whole city was shut down, not just the workers. And then the establishment said the weapon, it's a weapon of the revolution. And because it was so quiet, it upset them so much because it put the government out of operation. which I thought was interesting. Thus, the title, Self-Help in Hard Times. Okay.
Hi, Lisa.
Yes.
I just wanted to say there's been so many strikes and there was so much material this week to read. I remember that now, but it was at the beginning. So it's sort of, yes.
Yeah.
I remember those details of it though. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. I mean, did any of you know that there were this many strikes going on all the time in our history?
I didn't, and I certainly didn't know that there were strikes going on even during war, because the way it's presented usually is that everybody's united. I had no idea there were strikes going on then.
Okay.
Well, having lived 8 years in Raton with union railroad workers, union coal miners, the whole routine, the undercurrent between labor and management was always tense. And the ability to want to do something contrary to the expected norm that might even be disadvantage others on the other side was certainly there. But sometimes the management dug their own hole. There's a section of 3% railroad grade on the Santa Fe, now it's Burlington Northern Santa Fe, on the Trinidad side of the pass. It's some of the steepest standard grade railroad in the world. And during a strike of the railroad workers, the management personnel were running the locomotives and they stuck it in that spot going up the hill. And instead of easing into it, they tried to speed into it and spun the wheels on the power of the locomotives and dug such dips in the rail with the wheel spinning on the rail that it took a welder a couple of years to put enough steel back in to smooth out the road. So you have this back and forth between the workers and the management, very strong in the community.
Hey, Katya.
I think that's quite intentional that, the strikes and the rich history of striking is not publicized. In fact, I know that I remember in the last few years overhearing the discussion amongst teachers how, there was an attempt or even partially the attempt was successful to remove the history of labor movement from history books altogether, because I think it gives people an encouragement, sets a precedent, shows them the direction. So I think there's no surprise that, many Americans don't know about it.
I think I really agree with that statement. What about, did you guys, okay, I'll give you some hints. What was the longest strike? Do you remember that one? Because it talked about the longest lasting strike, the strike with the most people.
I don't. See, that's the kind of questions I don't ask.
And I can't find it, sorry.
Well, I know the United Auto Workers had a misunderstanding with the Fisher Body Plant of General Motors that lasted most of a winter.
Right. And is that the one that was a sit-in strike instead of a walkout strike?
It was a sit-in.
Okay, what did you guys think about the sit-in strikes? Because I just remember from the 60s, I was just a teenager, but all the sit-ins, let's have sit-in. And they did at UNM and all this stuff. So what was it about the sit-in strike that was more effective than the walkout strikes?
Well, they couldn't use strike breakers because the tools of production were controlled by those striking and setting in.
That was the biggest thing. What else? Let's look and see which one it was. My brain is fried. Remember the guy, oh, the restaurant worker. This was the idea of the sit-in that spread throughout 1936. And it began at the Fisher Body Plant in Flint, Michigan. And there was a restaurant owner across the street that prepared 3 meals a day for 2,000 strikers for 3 months. Have mercy. So they weren't hungry. Anybody remember anything else?
Well, the sit-in strikes were safer because, you couldn't use the police or militia easily against the strikers since they were, in their own space and they usually kind of like almost, were able to defend themselves and barricade. They had shelter, the communication was much better because they were all together. And yes, it was actually very gratifying to see the support of the community, how, it wasn't just the workers, but it's like the whole community supported them.
And they offered classes. I mean, it was like this whole community that just stayed in the workspace and took care of everything. I thought that was interesting. Okay, in the year 1936, there were 48 sit-down strikes. Oh wait, how did that one end? Did they get their stuff? Just a minute. Finally, this is the one we were talking about before. There was a settlement, a 6-month contract, leaving many questions unsettled, but recognizing that from now on, the company would have to deal not with individuals, but with the union. So that was the other thing that strike did, was give the union more power and more whatnot. So there were 48 sit-down strikes in 1936. In 1937, there were 477 sit-down strikes. So people really learned about that.
Well, a lot of this reflected the community anyway, like the individual providing food to the strikers across the street. The parsonage in Raton, when we were serving the church there, was across the street from Safeway. Safeway went out for, I believe it was 7 or 8 days. And we knew the assistant manager. And apparently only 6 people, no pickets out, or very few, but only 6 people crossed the picket lines in all that time, though it was the largest and most varied grocery store in town. The community was a strong union community, and they wouldn't cross a line of a striker whether or not the pickets were out.
Wow, that's great. Do any of you have parents or grandparents that told you about them going on strike?
Not on strike. My father was in management for a tire manufacturing company, and their workers went on strike. And I remember as a kid, I don't know how old I was, asking him what happened. And his comment was, well, the people in the administrative offices, went down and did the jobs of the people in the plant. And we found out that it took only a third as many of us as we had employed to do the job. So when the strike was over, they let people go. As a kid, of course, I was like, yay, Dad, Now I might have second thoughts about that today.
Wow, I haven't ever heard a story like that. Anybody else? Katja, did they ever, do you mind me asking how old you were when you came into America?
29.
29. So did you know anything about strikes and whatnot before you came to America?
Well, I mean, I was familiar with the concept of strike in general. And I mean, yeah, I mean, strikes are kind of studied, in history of any, like in general, if you
So did
study.
they have strikes in Russia?
In the Soviet Union, there were no strikes, but prior to the, basically the revolution of 1917 was, I mean, the whole revolutionary movement, like prior to that, that was all about strikes. And,
Okay, thanks. I just wondered because is that
it was like all bottled up, it's, you like put a lid on it and pretend that everyone is happy. But I mean, I do have to say that, when I moved to America, with all the criticism of the Soviet Union, there were some things I was just like horrified to discover. Like, I grew up with universal health care, and when I moved, I had a really hard time understanding and even like just was terrified of, okay, you pay insurance, but then when I found out that on top of paying insurance, you also have to pay like co-pays, and I just couldn't, because I grew up, you don't pay for, there's a tax, right? I mean, it gets taken out, but it's like, that's it. No one goes bankrupt because of medical bills. So, I mean, this is on the question that the Soviet Union did have a pretty incredible safety net, and Russia still has retained a pretty incredible safety net. I'm just gonna give one example. When my brother's son was in daycare, they live in St. Petersburg, I asked him how much he paid for it, and it's municipally subsidized daycare. And that was just a couple of years ago, $30 a month, including food. That's what they pay for municipally subsidized daycare.
good gravy? I used to work in daycare and feel so sorry for the people that had to pay it. And I still got lousy wages, but it was so, oh my gosh. See, that's the kind of thing that interests me, is all these things we were taught about Russia. Russia was the big bad this, the big bad that. And then they have some things better off than we do. The one thing about insurance, I always believed, or I was always taught, that the doctors under the universal healthcare systems were not as good as our doctors are. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I don't have any research on that. I actually think that the level of education in Russia, including like sciences in general, is very high, because actually one of the things that the 1917 revolution brought in is compulsory public education, and even a huge portion of in fact for decades higher education was free as well. Like, I got my master's degree for free, and on top of that I was being paid a stipend through all of my years of going to school. I've had some friends who were doctors, and I don't think that medical service is worse in any way. It's kind of like, to my analogy would be, okay, people would say, well, public education, so something that America has as well as Russia is public education. And so you can say, oh, well, so are, teachers in public education worse than teachers in private schools? And it's just not true. I mean, there are good teachers, there are bad teachers, there are good doctors, there are bad doctors. I think the expertise and quality of work ultimately reflects human nature, and sort of like our inherent work ethics, more so than the system in which we work.
Okay. Does anybody, my questions aren't really sparking anybody's brain.
Lisa,
Go ahead.
Ted's had his hand up for a while.
Oh, go ahead, Ted. Sorry.
Yeah, speaking of the healthcare, one of the reasons that the Bay of Pigs was such a fiasco is that Fidel Castro introduced universal healthcare in Cuba, and they had excellent healthcare following the Batista regime that virtually had nothing. And nobody wanted to go back to the US dominated past. And this was totally missed in the understandings in Washington when they tried to change regimes.
Go ahead.
Dave has his own.
Dave.
When it comes to discussing healthcare, and it's real simple. I've been with the VA since 2000, and that is basically, socialized healthcare because I don't pay a nickel. And of course, it's supposedly because I served. I understand that. But the experiences that I've had there with the doctors that I've had, I mean, I had cancer, I've had surgeries, I've had this and that and the other, and they take wonderful care of me. So whenever someone starts telling me that doctors are better under a private healthcare thing, I have to kind of say, yeah, that ain't necessarily so.
He's mad at him now, though, because his new GPA is a gerontologist.
Yeah, they figured it out that I was over 80, I guess, and so they said, well, that'll be interesting to see what she's all about. I haven't met her yet.
You know her name?
No, not yet.
Oh, okay. My dad had an excellent one there, and she was fabulous. So.
I have a joke about healthcare that was actually, I don't know if you guys know who David Sedaris is. He used to come to Pope Joy like pretty much every year. And one of his little, what would you call them, episodes was about, how the American perception of healthcare in socialist countries is that patients are sitting on beds waiting for aspirin to get invented. And it's just, and it's just, again, it's like kind of, it's capitalist propaganda.
Yes. And we are so full of that. And it is so discouraging to read that my country is such liars. It's really hard for me. The only experience I have with insurance in another country is my daughter went to England after she graduated. And she had asthma really badly. And of course, she had an asthma attack with all the moisture there, and she had to go to a hospital. So she went to a hospital, and she was telling the woman, I'm having an asthma attack. And all she would give her was antibiotics. And that didn't help. That doesn't help. So she was there for 7 days and had to come home. And we picked her up at the airport and took her right to the hospital. And she was sick for 3 months after that. So that's my only experience with government healthcare. So.
Katya?
Well, but I mean, I think anecdotal evidence like that, I mean, Lisa, not to say, I mean, I know you're just saying it's kind of one experience. I mean, I've had actually, I've had certain conditions that were not correctly diagnosed here, and it was actually Chinese medicine that helped me. So after going to several specialists here, I went to a doctor of Chinese medicine in a whole different system, right? And so this, I guess my point is that, we're not guaranteed against things like that either. There are plenty of conditions that get misdiagnosed or, not treated right, or, whatever it could be.
Right. I agree with that. Absolutely. Okay. What jumped out about this chapter about if you take care of the self-help idea, the title of it?
Betsy?
Well, I was amazed because I know they talked about the New Deal after the Depression, and they didn't mention anything about WPA or CCC, those programs. And I know they did a lot to put people back to work and to help people feel like they were doing something productive. I grew up in a small town in Kansas, and we had a bunch of buildings built by the WPA, still standing, working great. We had my high school in another town had cobblestone streets made by the WPA. I just surprised he didn't mention any of that stuff.
I know, he kind of just mentions the negative stuff.
Ted?
That's fairly common with Zen, but yeah, there's also the history books, the travel books, the arts. An enormous amount of money was put into the arts during the Depression. I knew a railroader, there's a young man, posed for murals in the opera house there in Raton, the Schiller, because he was trying to get enough time with the railroad to go permanent. And at that time, he was a retired railroader, but he enjoyed pointing out his painting as part of the mural that was done by these artists during the Depression, by all the money that went into the arts of that time. And they still use these WPA local history books for research purposes because they were so good. I happen to have the one on New Mexico, which is the WPA edition.
Wow.
Dave?
I don't know if y'all know it or not, but the Albuquerque Little Theater was built by the WPA.
No.
Yes, it was. It used to
So
be.
was Roosevelt Park here in Albuquerque was a WPA or CCC project.
Yeah, the theater was much smaller then, and they didn't build dressing rooms, so they bought a railroad car and set it behind, and they used that for the dressing rooms. That was a long time ago. But yeah, it was built by the WPA.
In my grade school was a WPA building.
Where was your grade school?
Truth or Consequences, Hot Springs.
I think my elementary school was a WPA project, now that I remember. So that's a great history, and I kind of was disappointed he didn't mention anything at all.
I thought that too.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to make a segue into the next chapter. And my mother grew up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the secret city where the bomb was built.
The other secret city.
Well, there were several. Oak Ridge did the uranium purification process. The bomb was built in Los Alamos.
Right. Well,
And Hartford, Washington did the plutonium.
And what did California do?
She's got some neat stuff there.
Well, this is a paper from Oak Ridge. And I think it's hard to see because it's shiny. But this is, my mother kept all of these. And I had them laminated so I could use them in my classes when I taught 5th grade. And they couldn't care less about all of these things. That really expensive shoes were $5 and a loaf of bread cost 10 cents. And the war and all that. They had a cow. When I opened, I said, oh, here's the TV. You know, what's on TV? All of them went bonkers because there was only 3 stations and they couldn't handle it. So that cracked me up. Okay, so this is the one after they bombed. And then this one I love because my mother put on red lipstick and for the piece. But I remember my mother, she said, oh, we were so together. We were so, everybody worked together. And she just thought that was wonderful. So we'll talk about that. Eleanor will talk about that in a minute. And the only other thing I want to mention is there's 2 places in this one that talked about Trinity Site, but it wasn't called Trinity Site. And they said that when they tested the bomb, people felt it 600 miles away. And their windows blew out and all that stuff. So these are just really
600 miles.
Huh?
Not any 600 miles.
Oh, was it 300?
I have had a classmate whose mother at about 100 miles saw the flash, but there
Right.
wasn't much in the way of sound. No, I've been to Trinity site twice and had Trinitite, the stone made out from the explosion since 1951. So this is old home week. Fact is, the individual who flipped the automatic timer for Trinity was a former date of Eleanor's mother at the University of Wisconsin.
Yep.
It's a small world.
Yeah. Okay, so that's our segue. And
Yeah. And
only
okay.
thing I wanted to mention was it says in the papers, but you know, it's a paper, that nobody knew what they were doing. Even all the people that worked there, everything was compartmentalized. And so is that not true either?
Right.
The Los Alamos group had Oppenheimer-led meetings discussing a lot of this proposal, how to do it. For instance, they knew that they could use a gun barrel charge for the uranium device, but they had to come up with an implosive device in order to set the plutonium off. So there's quite a bit of discussion involved in this, figuring out how to do it. Now, still, you're looking at a group of, a couple hundred people, but yes, they had to share knowledge to solve their problems because they had some very serious engineering problems figuring out how to do this.
Wow, so newspapers lied back in the 1940s too. Okay, Eleanor, you're on.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the questions that I have is we make the bomb, we do all the work for years to get it made, but then did we really have to use it? It looked like we were close, and this is my first question. The Japanese were very close to wanting to surrender. The emperor is even talking to people about surrendering before we dropped the bomb. So why did we do it? Was it an experiment where we just said, well, we put all this work into it, so we're going to use it? I mean, this is an issue that's still being discussed today. Why did we go ahead and drop the bomb on Hiroshima and then a few days later, Nagasaki? Was it necessary to force Japan to surrender?
I have thoughts, but Katya put her hand up.
Well, it seems the thought that goes through many chapters in this book is that a lot of what is done is about spheres of influence. And what Zinn says, one of the thoughts that he puts forward, it was Americans wanted to make sure that the Japanese surrendered to the United States and not to the Russian army. And it wasn't just like a competition vanity thing. It was about, who was going to have the influence over the Japanese. And that's what all the human lives, the loss of all the human lives was about, which is just horrific.
Yeah, Russia was about to come into the war against Japan, and the U.S. wanted to beat them to it. That's one of the things I figured we wanted to get the influence on Japan.
Well, it was more complicated than that. Russia had agreed to enter the war against Japan 90 days after Germany surrendered. And there was a push to try to utilize these devices prior to the Russian entry. There was also the fact that Japan did not know about this agreement diplomatically, and they were going to the Soviet Union to be the third party to handle peace negotiations because they knew they had lost the war and wanted out. And the Soviet government settled the negotiations because they wanted to grab all they could when that 90 days was up. There is also the fact that those involved in the development of the bomb were scientifically interested in what kind of damage it would actually do on a civilian target. You have all of these things working in it, and it's hard to say who's guilty of what when.
Yeah, yeah. It's a complicated issue.
Ryan, what did you want to say?
I mean, it's probably just speculation, but it all comes down to fear, right? I mean, Katya's right that it's about spheres of influence. And right, if you can do it once, that says something. But if you can do it twice when they're already ready to surrender, it says that you have no qualms and probably no limits to the number of times you can do it. It's not something we've figured out and we're tapped out now. It says we can do it again and again and again to intimidate and prove our superiority.
Incidentally, there was not enough of the appropriate nuclear material available for a third bomb until around mid-September. So we shot everything we had with those two. There's also the problem with the islands right north of Japan that were Japanese control. The Russians grabbed and they're still arguing about, what to do about that. There is, well, it's just a very gray area. Plus the fact that these weapons were relatively low yield compared to what they now have with the thermonuclear. So the whole world out there is setting in a situation where it's not, where they talk about overkill. How many times over do we have enough of these things to essentially wipe out humanity on Earth? It's not once, it's several times over.
Yeah, between Russia and us,
and the Chinese and the Israelis,
yeah,
and the Pakistanis and the French and the British and the Indians, the whole bunch is nuclear.
Okay, I want to mention that this chapter 16 seems to be the most slanted of, as in maybe not the most, but it's very slanted.
Eleanor, before you go on, Katya put her hand up again.
Oh,
sorry. I just had a comment. Something I was thinking when I was reading this. That has to do with the contemporary situation. You know how there've been all kinds of efforts to have Iran give up their, the pursuit of nuclear weapons, and the same thing with North Korea. But when you read about the level of American intervention around the world, you really understand that many countries, whatever regimes they are, feel like unless they have the nuclear program, they are at the mercy of the United States. And when we're talking about disarmament, if we can't just be telling a different country to disarm without willing to disarm ourselves, because that's hypocritical. There should be nuclear disarmament across the board, and that's going to be the only kind of disarmament that would be possible, because otherwise it's just like a handful of countries with nuclear weapons that are in charge of the rest of the world. And that goes to the fear factor that Ryan brought up.
okay.
I heard this morning on NPR that the UN passed a nuclear weapons ban that 50 countries signed. Of course, the US and NATO opposed it, but it's in the water again to eliminate this everywhere.
But part of the problem is not only the actual manufactured weapons, it's the blasted raw materials, because plutonium is a natural byproduct of any nuclear reactor. And Japan, for instance, has an enormous amount of its power comes from nuclear. Well, they do not have reprocessing abilities. They ship their waste to France, which reprocesses it and then sends the materials back to Japan, which includes, they have enough plutonium in storage to make probably several hundred nuclear weapons. They are very kind about not doing it. But what are you going to do with this darn stuff that has a half-life of millions of years, is very poisonous, and under certain circumstances can create a humongous bang?
Okay, so what I was starting off to say was that the Zen is kind of slanted in the way he approaches this. For example, he does not mention Eisenhower's warning about the military-industrial complex, the speech that Eisenhower gave toward the end of his presidency, talking about the fact that we have got to be aware of the fact that the US is on a war footing almost constantly, thanks to the Truman Doctrine and other, the Marshall Plan. The US opted to basically have a permanent war economy. Okay, starting to stabilize our modern economy, the one we're still in. And it seems like, and I'd like some discussion on this, because this happened after World War II, and we've been on this war footing, war economy basically since after World War II. And that's, it can be a dangerous thing. It seems like we've also been at war, either Cold War or hot war, but the whole time since World War II. And this is not a good thing. This, I think, you know, looking at it from that perspective, it's been off and on, but it's certainly been on more than it's been off. Now, the other thing is, we have also did not approve of, and this is up for discussion, the US government has not approved of any wars of national liberation. It seems like we've gone in and screwed up people who were trying to bring about a revolution, especially if it was from the left. And that's in part our fear of communism. We got into this fear, and it's fear of communism that has motivated the US from the end of World War II on to operate and support right-wing fascist, if you will, governments. Even though we were fighting the fascists in Germany, we have since then opted the other way. At least that's the way I see it. And I think, so Eisenhower warned about this, and he could see that's what was happening in the few years, in the 8 years he was president. But we've still, it hasn't done any good. We've gone in to fight for American interests everywhere that we could. The immediate example that Zen mentions is Guatemala actually had put in a democratic government, and we go in and screw it up. Oh, in Cuba, it had more to do with fruit. Okay, yeah.
I guess my question is whether Eisenhower did anything to control the military-industrial complex. I mean, I'm familiar with those words of his, which were uttered at the very end of his presidency. There's a documentary by Oliver Stone on Netflix, which is like a series. It's very similar to Zen's book in terms of, like, you know, it takes different events in history. And, you know, one of the things he pointed out, that Eisenhower only kind of came to that realization at the end of his presidency, while most of his presidency was dedicated to pretty much, you know, to building the military-industrial complex, like it seems like everyone's presidency is dedicated to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Katya shared in the in the chat that the military-industrial complex is a large reason we have no money for the people. The
That's
Poor
right.
People campaign
That's
advocates
right.
specifically for a transition from a war economy to a peace economy.
Yeah.
And
We
while
just
there isn't a
haven't
lot of
done
evidence
that.
out there for it, I contend that if we spent that money on caring for our people and supporting countries that are in deep need, there wouldn't be any need for us to continue in the military-industrial complex. When I think of small scale, like motivations for crime, Clark, I'm talking right now. Please wait.
So Lisa, you had your hand up.
Well, I'm not quite finished yet. When I think about small scale, like motivations for crime, it's frequently desperation, a need for resources that can't be had any other way. And so if we were to share resources with communities and nations in need, then crime and war motivations would drop significantly. You know, and we wouldn't need to spend it on developing a stronger military. All right, now I'm done. Thanks, Lisa.
I think that's what the last chapter was saying, that in that Salem, Washington Union fight, that they didn't need the government, and it's the government's fear, it's the elite's fear that we won't need them. Because through the other part, you know, it said when there was this meat strike or something, I don't remember, and so those people went and traded with the fruit and vegetable people and that type of thing. So to me, that's exactly. And then my other thing I was going to say is that we only had the Cold War, so we would stay in a war economy.
Yeah.
We didn't need the Cold War. And then when we found out what the two factions behind it, it was stupid. And all it did was make more money for the military-industrial complex.
Yes. All right. That I agree with you. And here's where I ought to mention the good old HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee, and of course McCarthy. Okay.
Katya, do you want to weigh in before we get to the HUAC?
What I have here is the song dealing with the one of the things Zen is missing is all of the protest music that was taking place during this time, starting in the 30s. And the civil rights movement, all of this had some very, very sharp music critical of the establishment.
Where's the,
and for the
I
most,
need all the words, not just the chorus.
I'll get it.
Okay.
Before we dive in too deep to that and get away from it, Katya, I think had something before we move on.
There was a great interview on Democracy Now! This past week. It was an investigative journalist from Intercept. I thought his last name was Rachel. I Googled the name and couldn't find it. I was going to give the link to it, but anyways, Zim points out the conservative liberal consensus on supporting the military-industrial complex and the philosophy of war, and that's actually something that the journalist was talking about, and he was saying again that it's absolutely bipartisan. Even during the Trump administration, even though liberals kept criticizing Trump's on all kinds of issues, he actually gave the numbers of how many Democrats voted to give him more surveillance power. It was like 240 against 40 votes against, just on the Democratic side. Something similar, they the absolute overwhelming Democratic majority supported, Trump's military budget. And so it kind of goes along with what I'm reading here, is that liberal conservative consensus on imperialism just has existed for decades, if not centuries, and that's very sad.
Yeah. Well, I'm just going to read you one verse from the folk song. This is one of the first ones I collected in the early 60s when I started collecting folk songs. But the old HUAC, I'm not going to try to sing it just the first verse. I am a college student and I've come to sing a song. I've always been a liberal. I've never thought it wrong. But I have come to tell you to take warning from me, or you may have to tangle with the old HUAC. And then the chorus is HUAC, HUAC, what a lucky thing it is for you and me that our freedoms are well guarded by politically retarded men of unimpeachable integrity. And there's a bunch of verses that continue trying to be progressive, but I never was a red. I thought the First Amendment meant exactly what it said. Anyway, it's in that vein. And of course, we're fighting that now with the scare tactics that we're seeing in the political climate now. And they're, screaming that we're going to become a socialist country and blah, blah, blah. It's the same kind of fear mongering we had then.
Laurie wants to talk.
So somebody.
Laurie.
On my way back from one of my trips last year, I was seated next to a young lady who had grown up in India, but was currently working in Amsterdam. And she asked me about, people's opinion about Trump. And anyway, in talking, it seems that not only the nationalism that we see in our country is here, she said it was beginning to be that way, even in the Netherlands and also in India. And I find that very discouraging because so many of the problems that we need to face are global problems. They're not national problems.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. In fact, Hungary and Turkey, a lot of Europe seems to be drifting that way. I see that, and it's scary, actually, I think. Okay. So I'm back to the end of World War II, or just before the end. The structure, the UN was created, or the idea for it was being developed during World War II. So how did the structure of the UN allow it to be controlled by basically the 5 countries that have veto power? The US, France, England, USSR, and China are all have a veto power. And all the other countries, basically, they can have input, but it's those 5 countries that control the UN. How does that benefit the world? I'm throwing that out has it benefited the world? Yeah, Dave.
That's probably why the UN is so ineffective. The back in caveman days, I think the guy that had the biggest club was usually the leader and had the most power. And
yeah,
I think that's just carried through various types of armament and the quest for power. I want to be the most powerful guy, and so therefore I'm going to carry the biggest club. And if I make an organization that's global, I'm going to make sure that I still have all the power because I still want to carry the biggest club. I think it's just that simple.
Yeah. It's still all about power and control of finances in control of, you know, whatever you can control. You know, I start despairing of us ever growing up and actually being egalitarian. And okay. So I'm trying to see here. So we've kind of covered most of what I picked out. Yeah, Lisa.
I would just like us to end with reading this poem by Langston Hughes. I loved him. I used him all the time when I taught 5th grade. And listen to the last line of his poem, and then I would like you to comment on that. I am the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I am the Negro bearing slavery's scars. I am the red man driven from the land. I am the immigrant clutching the hope I seek and finding only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet. What do you guys think of that line? The land that never has been yet.
Yeah. Betsy.
Well, it certainly doesn't live up to the concept of all men created equal and the rights and all that. And I thought it was pretty interesting. He made a comment on during World War II, the Red Cross kept the Negroes' blood separately from the whites' blood, and it's like red blood, you guys. But the guy that developed the cross-matching whole science was a black man. So I found that really kind of sort of funny. It was ironic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think we're about out of time. Anybody have any last thoughts?
No, I just like to clarify though, for next week, are we doing the next 2 chapters?
Well, I'm assuming so. They actually haven't been recorded yet. Don's supposed to get them done on Tuesday so they can be released on Wednesday. It's ready to go, but she's been out of pocket.
Yeah, 17 and 18 are the next 2.
Okay, thank you.
So.
Okay.
Lisa, I need to talk to you before you go off.
All right, I'm going to end our live streaming, but thank you all for your participation, and to Lisa and Eleanor and Ted